This is a Raspberry Pi Zero. A number of heads turned when this little guy was announced. Raspberry Pis in general have always been a tremendous value. An experiment on what current technology can pack under a very limited budget that leads to a large community of makers, tons of software, and now even proper industry application. But even for those standards, the original Zero seemed like an insane proposal. A full Linux-capable ARM PC for $5. A brain for any project at nearly pocket change. How was this possible? This was followed up by a slight variation on the Raspberry Pi Zero W, which adds very useful Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity, while still maintaining a price under most computer accessories or even laptop dongles. As the low-spec guy on YouTube, I have been long fascinated by this computer, and I wanted to at least open the doors towards experimenting with its gaming capabilities, limited as they might be. On a previous video, I visited the only official Raspberry Pi store in the world in Cambridge, and on that trip I had the opportunity to visit the Raspberry Pi trading offices and speak with Evan Upton, CEO of the company and one of the original creators of Raspberry Pi. One of the things I was curious to ask about is how they managed to squeeze the maximum amount of value on the very small budgets of their devices.
It's a little bit of everything. So I think that there's an attention to detail that's always been part of Raspberry Pi's engineering culture. So we really care about a 1 cent component. The way you build a $35 computer is you care about 1 cent components. You care a lot about 5 and 10 cent components. We would say when we started Raspberry Pi, we imagined the difficult thing would be the $5 components, the big components on the board. But it's not, because there aren't many of those. It's actually the 10 cent components that kill you. So there's a lot of effort goes into taking components out of the board. There's a lot of effort goes into making sure that you use the best quality, most cost-effective, most available. And available is really important, right? Because we're making 500,000 Raspberry Pis a month. Doesn't matter if you get a really great HDMI connector that hardly costs anything. If you can only buy 10,000 of them a month, then what's the point? So that's a thing. So there's an attention to detail on the hardware side. There's attention to detail on the software side. We've always done a lot of work to try and squeeze performance out of the device, and we've always been committed to taking older Raspberry Pis with us on the journey. So if you go and download a Raspberry Pi software image from our website today, it will run on the Alpha boards, which are the 50 short-run prototype boards from the summer of 2011. Still run on those. Our modern desktop environment will run not particularly well, because the machine's only got a quarter of a gigabyte of memory, right? But it will run okay on those devices. So there's an attention to detail in software in terms of pushing performance up and bringing all the devices with us. It's a culture thing, I guess. And then obviously there's scale. We just make a lot of them. If you make a lot of something, then you realize economies of scale, which were never available to us when we were just building 10,000 units.
So of course, I had to ask about the efforts it took to get the Zero to work on its very limited budget.
So Zero was, I think all of those things played into Raspberry Pi Zero. I mean, Zero is a very aggressively cost-engineered device. You look at it, it's a small PCB. It's a single-sided PCB, so it only goes through the pick-and-place machine once. It has no through-hole components, so it doesn't get wave soldered. It doesn't have hand insertion. It's designed to be tested very fast at scale. So there's lots of design and manufacturing side things going on. And then, yes, obviously, we're big. And so, there are some components on there where we were really able to strike aggressive deals to get the cost structure down.
And I could not let him go without at least asking about the possibility of a Raspberry Pi Zero 2, although it turns out we might have to be patient for that.
Yeah, right. And of course, there's Zero 2 is something, or Zero 2, Zero Plus is something that people talk about a lot. And it's something I think about a lot. I think it's something that's very hard to build, because you have the only chip we have that will fit into a Zero form factor. If you go look at our Pi 2, Pi 3, Pi 3 Plus, if you look at all those chips, they won't physically fit into a Zero form factor because they have separate memory. Yeah. So the only POP device that we have is 2835, and that's kind of limited the scale of Zero. And we've sold nearly 2 million Zero and Zero Ws. So, it's been a very popular platform, but there's not an obvious route to make a dual core Zero or an ARM v7 or ARM v8 Zero.
My conversation with Mr. Upton was quite long, so if you want to catch some of the other topics he commented on, you will have to see the previous videos and keep an eye on the channel for a video next week that might be quite unexpected. While I was at the store, to my wallet's horror, I ended up impulse buying a bunch of gaming-related project materials which you might have seen on their own videos. Some eagle eye viewers have noted there's a bag that I have picked which I had yet to mention. This bag in question contains what is called a Joy Bonnet Pack. This is basically a Raspberry Pi Zero W, a plastic case, adapters and GPIO pins, with a hat with buttons and control sticks that can easily build a tiny plug-and-play console. If you do not want to make the monetary or time investment into something like a full Pi arcade, but still want to explore the Raspberry Pi gaming projects, this is a simpler and cheaper entry point. Do keep in mind that regular Raspberry Pi Zeros and Ws do not have GPIO pins. These kits usually include this adapter, which you can use to add those pins, but this will require a bit of tricky soldering, which might be a problem if you have never done any soldering before. If you want to avoid that, you can also consider getting a Raspberry Pi Zero WH, which already has the GPIO pins, which is a bit more expensive but still ridiculously cheap for a computer of any kind. Since there are no instructions, it can take a bit of fiddling to figure out how the Pi fits correctly on its plastic case, but once it is done, it looks very nice. After assembly, it is fairly easy to install the game controller hat to the GPIO pins and use the included adapter for video output and keyboard. One improvement that I will suggest is applying some glue to the stick's cap, which falls out extremely easy. RetroPie has a build recommended for the Raspberry Pi Zero, so I will use that as an OS. And after connecting it to Wi-Fi, getting the controller to work is as easy as downloading and installing a single script. But as usual, it took a bit of troubleshooting to get it to work, since I kept getting segmentation and bus errors. A part of the Raspberry Pi experience that does not get talked about enough is that there's always a degree of technical problem solving that is required for every project. While for commercial releases of stuff like games and drivers you sort of expect a certain degree of stability, Raspberry Pis are, at the end of the day, tools for learning, making and hacking. And their openness and focus on community software inevitably leads to some errors, which can be a bit of a frustrating experience if you're not super versed in working around Linux. But if you keep your expectations in check and apply a bit of patience, you can learn quite a bit. Some googling led to people saying this was either a bad power source or a bad SD card, and considering I'm using an official power supply, I decided to change the SD card, which did not eliminate the errors, but made them infrequent enough that I could launch games. And now it only happens on the emulation station rather than the games, so I can work with that. The Pi Zero is powered by a BCM2835 single-core processor and 512 MB of RAM, which is surprisingly good for the price point. It is enough to emulate something like an NES, Game Boy Advance or almost Super Nintendo, although consoles from that generation can give it a bit of trouble, as you might be noticing. Let's try something else. On a previous video, I geeked out at Pico 8, a virtual machine for miniature games that runs quote-unquote natively on Raspberry Pi and includes all the materials necessary for game creation and distribution. There are a number of very interesting and cool looking games on this platform, which is so light it seems to work without problems, thus extending the range of games this small thing can try to things like the fun remake of Fez and the original version of Celeste. There is still what I believe is some room for experimentation. Removing the plastic cover in the setup to open up space for a small heatsink might make GPU overclocking possible, but that is a topic for the future. In case you're interested in that, just let me know in comments.